What if your partner isn't just controlling you, but slowly erasing your identity, one thought at a time, until you can't remember who you used to be? I never thought you'd do this to me. Evelyn's voice sliced through the dim hum of the kitchen, where the faint scent of cooling coffee lingered like a forgotten promise, heavy and bitter in the stale air. She clutched the envelope in her fist, its edges crumpled and frayed, the paper stark white against her paling knuckles, veins standing out like faint rivers under strain. Marcus stood by the sink, arms crossed tightly over his chest, his gaze fixed on the tiled floor as if it held some secret worth unraveling in the oppressive quiet. Sophie hovered at the table, her fingers twisting the hem of her sweater with nervous insistence, eyes darting between them like a cornered animal sizing up shadowed escape routes amid the flickering light. The letter had arrived that morning, slipped under the door without a stamp or sender's mark, its arrival a silent intrusion into their fragile routine. Evelyn had torn it open alone at first, her heart thudding in the quiet hours before the others stirred, the paper crinkling like a whisper of doom. Words scrawled in neat, anonymous script, details of stolen meetings in shadowed cafes, whispered promises in hotel rooms thick with the scent of cheap perfume and regret, the kind of intimacy that twisted like a knife in the gut. Rachel, Sophie in this fractured circle, her supposed confidant, entangled with Tom, Marcus, the man she'd vowed to rebuild a life with amid the damp walls and echoing doubts. Dates, times, even the scent of Sophie's perfume clinging to his collar like a ghost. Facts laid bare like evidence in a trial no one wanted, under the weight of unspoken accusations. Marcus shifted uneasily, his indifference cracking just enough to let a flicker of irritation show in the tightening of his jaw. "What's this about now, Evelyn? Another one of your hunches?" His tone was flat, a shield against the accusation blooming in the air like toxic fog. But beneath it simmered that masked anger, the kind that coiled tight and waited to strike in the dim, suffocating space. Sophie let out a small, brittle laugh, the sound scraping against the oppressive silence like nails on glass. "Hunches? Is that what we're calling it? Evelyn, you always see shadows where there are none. Remember that time with the neighbor's car? You were so sure." Her words trailed off into the heavy air, passive-aggressive barbs laced with anxiety that hung like damp mist. Her drive for acceptance pushing her to deflect, to cling to the fragile web of their shared history amid the creaking floorboards and faint, musty odor. But her eyes betrayed her, wide and pleading, as if begging the room to affirm she was still lovable, still one of them, in this crumbling sanctuary. Evelyn unfolded the letter again, her movements deliberate and slow, each crease a deliberate accusation unfolding in the low light. The words blurred slightly in the dim glow filtering through half-drawn blinds, dust motes swirling lazily, but they burned clear in her mind like embers. Sophie's laughter echoing in a bar on Elm Street, Marcus's hand on her waist in the dim haze of neon, the betrayal scripted in ink that seeped into her thoughts. Trust had been their ritual here. Late-night confessions over wine that stained lips red. Evelyn's guarded stories of past hurts, shared in hushed tones. Marcus's rare nods of solidarity amid the flicker of a single lamp. Sophie's eager interjections, seeking her place in the circle. All stitched together in this cramped apartment that smelled of damp wood and unspoken doubts. Walls pressing close like silent witnesses. Now, it all unraveled slowly, thread by thread. Evelyn's suspicion, once a quiet undercurrent humming beneath the surface, flooded the space, distorting the familiar lines of their faces in the oppressive twilight. She wanted to believe it was a lie, to claw back the vulnerability she'd risked in fragile moments, but the details gnawed at her, too precise, too intimate, like thorns embedding deeper. Her shadow stirred within, the urge to manipulate, to turn the tables and expose them before they could wound her deeper, rising like bile in the thickening air. Marcus finally met her eyes, his closed-off posture unyielding as stone. "Show me." It wasn't a question, but a demand wrapped in protection, his fear of opening up manifesting as this cold barrier that chilled the room. He stepped closer, the floorboards creaking under his weight like protesting bones, and snatched the paper from her hand with a rustle that echoed sharply. Sophie edged forward too, her breath quickening in shallow, ragged pulls. "Let me see. This is ridiculous. We're friends, aren't we?" The plea hung there, laced with dread that seeped into every corner, her passive aggressiveness fracturing into raw need that clawed at the silence. As Marcus scanned the lines, his face remained a mask of stoic calm, but Evelyn caught the subtle tick in his jaw, the way his fingers gripped tighter, knuckles blanching white. The room pressed in relentlessly, walls seeming to lean with the weight of what was unsaid, the air thick with the metallic tang of unease and the faint, lingering bitterness of coffee. Trust, so tentatively rebuilt in whispers and shared glances, splintered in that moment, leaving only echoes of connection warped into something treacherous and cold. Evelyn watched them, her heart a hollow ache throbbing in her chest, wondering if the fracture would swallow them whole in the encroaching dark. The echo of Evelyn's accusation lingered like a pall over the house, the kitchen's dim light fading into oppressive twilight, shadows stretching long across the worn surfaces. Disbelief twisted into a sharper anger, suspicion coiling in her chest as the letter's implications gnawed deeper, relentless and unyielding. Hours slipped by in contemplative silence, the melancholic weight of dread settling heavier with each breath, pulling her inexorably toward Tom and the truths he would deny in the suffocating quiet. "Betrayed me like this, after everything we've built?" Sophie's voice cracked on the last word, raw and fraying, her fingers twisting the frayed edge of the sofa cushion as if it could anchor her unraveling thoughts against the rising tide. The living room felt like a tomb, walls pressing in with their faded wallpaper peeling at the corners like old skin, the faint tick of the mantel clock marking seconds like accusations in the heavy air. She thrust the crumpled letter toward Marcus, its ink-smudged words accusing him of siphoning funds from their shared account. Funds meant for the life they all clung to in this crumbling house, where dust motes danced in the dim shafts of light. Marcus leaned back in the armchair, his posture a deliberate slump that sagged into the cushions, eyes fixed on the scuffed floorboards rather than her face, avoiding the storm brewing. The scent of stale tobacco clung to his shirt, mingling with the musty dampness that never quite left the air, a cloying reminder of habits unshared. "You're reading too much into it, Soph. It's not what it looks like." His tone was flat, indifferent, as if her fury were just another chore to dismiss amid the creaking silence. Inside, that familiar anger simmered, masked by the wall he'd built high enough to keep her out. But the letter poked holes in it, threatening to flood everything with cold doubt. Nathan stood by the window, arms crossed over his chest, his silhouette rigid against the dim glow filtering through grimy panes streaked with rain. He hadn't touched the letter yet, but his gaze dissected every line Marcus refused to meet, sharp and unblinking. "Explain it then," Nathan said, his voice low and measured, each syllable a probe into the fracture that hummed beneath. He needed the why, the mechanism behind this crack in their fragile triad. Control it, understand it, before it exposed his own vulnerabilities in the oppressive gloom. But Sophie's desperation gnawed at him, her eyes pleading for validation he couldn't afford to give freely, lest it weaken his grip. Sophie paced a tight circle, her footsteps muffled on the threadbare rug that smelled faintly of faded wool, breath coming in shallow bursts that stirred the dust motes into lazy spirals in the stale air. "Not what it looks like? It's your signature, Marcus. Right there, authorizing the transfer to some account I don't recognize. We've trusted you with this, all of us." Her words laced with that passive edge, not quite demanding, but slicing nonetheless, born from the fear that coiled in her gut like icy wire. Unlovable, abandoned, left to sift through the debris alone in the dim light. Marcus finally looked up, his indifference cracking just enough to reveal the shadow beneath, a flicker of rage in his narrowed eyes that darkened the room further. "I didn't do it. Someone must have forged it. You think I'd sabotage us? After what we've been through?" He protected that core of himself fiercely, the one that ached from old wounds like phantom pains, refusing to open the floodgates of vulnerability. But doubt crept in, mirroring hers, suspicion seeding in the silence that pressed heavy as fog. Nathan stepped forward, snatching the letter from Sophie's hand with a precision that bordered on possession, the paper crinkling sharply. He scanned it again, tracing the loops of the handwriting under the weak lamplight, his mind mapping contingencies, isolations he could enforce to regain footing amid the unraveling. This doesn't add up. The dates align with that trip you took alone, Marcus. Coincidence? His question hung, not accusatory yet, but laced with the dread of naivety exposed, a chill that seeped into the bones. He loathed the weakness it implied, the loss of control as their shared trust splintered like dry wood. Sophie sank onto the sofa, her body curling inward against the lumpy cushions, the weight of their stares pressing like invisible hands in the thickening air. The room's shadows deepened, pooling in the corners where secrets festered like mold. Marcus's denial echoed hollowly, stirring more questions than answers. Had he slipped? Or was something darker at play in the melancholic hush? Nathan's probing gaze only amplified the unease, turning their once safe haven into a labyrinth of whispers and withheld truths that echoed softly. Suspicion bloomed, slow and insidious, twisting the melancholic ache into something sharper, more oppressive, as the contemplative hush between them stretched, unbroken and suffocating. Hours dragged into a suffocating night, the living room's stale air thickening with unspoken accusations that clung like smoke. Claire's chest tightened, dread coiling like smoke in her lungs, each tick of the clock amplifying the void left by Tom's absence in the dim glow. The betrayal gnawed deeper, unraveling her fragile calm thread by thread, until suspicion propelled her, trembling, resolute, toward the shadowed corner where his belongings lay untouched, secrets festering in the gloom like hidden rot. "Why would you hide this from me, Nathan?" Evelyn's voice sliced through the stifling quiet, her eyes narrowing at the phone clutched in Sophie's whitening knuckles, the screen's faint glow casting eerie shadows. Sophie froze mid-scroll, the screen's glow casting harsh shadows across her face, like cracks in porcelain, illuminating the tension in her jaw. The device vibrated faintly against her palm, a silent pulse that echoed the frantic beat in her chest, quick and erratic. She had snatched it from Nathan's jacket pocket moments ago, her passive-aggressive barbs giving way to this desperate rummage, anything to validate the trust she'd clung to, even as abandonment clawed at her edges like cold fingers. The living room's dim lamp flickered uncertainly, illuminating the scattered cushions and the half-empty teacups on the coffee table, their contents long gone cold, like the bonds fraying between them, a faint herbal scent lingering. Nathan leaned forward from his armchair, his posture unyielding as iron, fingers steepled as if to cage the chaos unfolding in the heavy air. "Put it down, Sophie. You're jumping to conclusions." His words carried that rigid edge, a command masked as concern, that chilled the room. His fear of appearing weak twisting into this need to steer the narrative amid the creaking silence. But inside, doubt gnawed. Had his control slipped so far that he'd overlooked the signs of his own isolation creeping in? Evelyn shifted on the sofa beside Sophie, her body coiled like a spring ready to snap, suspicion etching lines around her mouth in the dim light. She wanted to believe again, to rebuild something solid after her scars that still throbbed faintly, but every instinct screamed manipulation in the oppressive weight. "If there's nothing to hide, let her look," she pressed, her tone guarded, probing for the vulnerability she dreaded facing in herself, voice low and steady. Sophie's thumb hesitated over the messages, the air thickening with the scent of stale coffee and unspoken accusations that hung palpably. She tapped open the thread from an unknown number, words blooming across the screen in stark black type. "Meet me tonight. She suspects nothing. Keep her in the dark." Then another. "The money's safe. Don't let Evelyn catch on." Her breath hitched, a sharp intake that tasted of bile rising in her throat. Betrayal unfurled like smoke, distorting the room's familiar contours, the mantel clock's relentless tick now a dirge in the hush, the wallpaper's peeling edges mocking the fragility of their shared illusions under the flickering light. "Nathan," Sophie whispered, her voice fracturing as she turned the phone toward him, the glow illuminating her wide eyes. "Who is this?" Anxiety flooded her, passive-aggressive jabs forgotten in the raw terror of unlovability crashing down like a wave. The messages blurred through unshed tears, each one a fracture in the safety she'd mistaken for connection, the air growing colder. He snatched the device, his face paling to a ghostly white, control shattering into rigid denial that echoed in his sharp exhale. "It's not what you think. I was handling it, for us." But his eyes darted, betraying the obsession that had isolated him, the fear of naivety now a noose tightening around his throat in the dim room. Evelyn rose slowly, her suspicion hardening into something colder, unyielding as frost, her drive for trust curdling into dread that seeped into her veins. "For us? Or for you?" She stepped closer, the floorboards creaking under her weight like weary sighs, amplifying the oppressive weight of revelations piling like debris in the shadows. Fear seeped into her bones, the specter of another betrayal coiling tight. Had she manipulated the moment to shield herself, only to invite the wound deeper into the melancholic quiet? Sophie sank back, the sofa enveloping her like quicksand, soft and unforgiving, her world tilting in the dim light. The innocuous evenings of laughter and shared secrets shattered, replaced by this chasm of cryptic intent that yawned wide. Dread bloomed, slow and insidious, coloring every glance, every breath, with the chill certainty that nothing was as it seemed in the pressing gloom. The room pressed in, a melancholic tomb where trust lay in ruins, and fear whispered of fractures yet to come, soft and inevitable. Miles away, in the shadowed confines of her dimly lit apartment, Claire sat huddled under a threadbare blanket, the earlier tension from Evelyn's world echoing faintly in her own unraveling thoughts like distant thunder. Suspicions festered, like an untreated wound, throbbing with each heartbeat, her heart heavy with unspoken dread that weighed on her chest. The clock ticked oppressively into the late hours, isolation wrapping tighter around her as she finally reached for her phone, fingers hovering with melancholic resolve in the cool, empty air. Evelyn jabbed her thumb against Marcus's contact, the phone's screen blurring through the sting in her eyes that burned like salt. The room's dim lamp flickered like a failing heartbeat, casting Nathan's silhouette rigid against the wall where he stood, arms crossed, his gaze boring into her back with unyielding intensity. She pressed the device to her ear, the cool glass a fleeting anchor against the heat rising in her chest, pulse racing. "Marcus, it's me," she said when the line clicked open, her voice a thin thread in the oppressive hush that smothered the room. "I need to talk about Nathan." A pause stretched, heavy as the shadows pooling on the threadbare carpet, dust motes swirling lazily. Nathan shifted, his shoes scuffing the floorboards, a deliberate scrape that made her flinch in the tense air. He didn't speak, but his presence loomed, a wall of unspoken accusations, his drive to dissect every betrayal twisting the air tighter like a vice. On the other end, Marcus's exhale crackled through the speaker, indifferent as distant traffic rumbling faintly. "Evelyn, what now? It's late." She paced to the window, the curtains limp and dust-moted, hanging like weary veils, her free hand clutching the sill until her knuckles ached with the pressure. The city outside hummed faintly, indifferent to the fracture widening inside her, lights blurring in the night. That message on Sophie's phone. It's him, isn't it? Hiding things again. Telling her things he won't say to me. I thought we were past this." Nathan's reflection ghosted in the glass behind her, his jaw a carved line of tension, eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in that cold calculation, as if her doubt was just another variable to control in the dim glow. He wanted answers, reasons for the cracks, but his fear of weakness kept him silent, isolating them both in this suffocating tableau of shadows. Marcus chuckled, low and dismissive, the sound scraping like gravel underfoot in the quiet line. "Come on, Ev. Nathan's loyal as they come. You've got trust issues bigger than this. Remember last time? You spun circles over nothing and it blew up anyway. Let it go. Her breath hitched, the words landing like blows to an open wound that throbbed anew. Isolation bloomed in her gut, cold and vast as the night outside. Her drive to rebuild trust, crumbling under the weight of his casual deflection that echoed hollowly. She glanced at Nathan, who hadn't moved, his shadow self, the controller who pushed her away under the guise of protection. Mirroring her own shadows, the manipulations she wielded to shield her vulnerability like fragile armor. But Marcus's indifference masked something sharper, his anger simmering beneath, refusing to let her in lest it burn them both in the fire. "You're dismissing me," she whispered, the phone trembling against her cheek despite her resolve, voice barely above the hum. "Just like everyone does. I reach out, and it's nothing. Always nothing." "Look, protect yourself," Marcus said, his tone flattening, closed off as a locked vault sealed tight. "But don't drag me into your paranoia. Nathan's, fine. You're the one pushing him away." The line went dead with a soft beep, leaving only the echo of her pulse in her ears, loud and insistent. Evelyn lowered the phone, her fingers numb and cold, and turned to face Nathan. His eyes met hers, probing, demanding the betrayal's root without yielding his own in the dim light. Marcus's words echoed, igniting the dread she'd buried. The fear that trust was a mirage, her relationship scarred deeper with each dismissal that lingered like smoke. She sank onto the edge of the sagging couch, the fabric rough against her palms, worn and unforgiving, tears tracing silent paths down her face in the quiet. Nathan remained standing, a sentinel of control, while the room pressed in, melancholic and unyielding, the weight of unspoken confessions thickening the air like fog. Marcus's absence lingered like a ghost, his indifference a fresh cut that burned, amplifying the sadness that coiled around her heart, slow and inexorable as the night deepened. Hours blurred into a suffocating night, Evelyn's call hanging unanswered in the oppressive air, Nathan's unyielding stare etching deeper lines of dread into her unraveling thoughts. Days later, across the shadowed sprawl of the city, Claire hunched over her screen in a melancholic haze, the cursor pulsing like a hesitant heartbeat in the dim blue glow. Whispers of betrayal clawed at the edges of her mind as she delved further, the digital veil thinning toward revelations that promised only heavier chains of sorrow. The porcelain cracked against the saucer, hot liquid seeping into the tablecloth like blood from a fresh wound, staining dark and irregular, before Sophie's eyes widened in feigned surprise that didn't reach their depths. Evelyn leaned forward in the dim booth of the cafe, the air thick with the bitter grind of espresso and the low hum of indifferent conversations murmuring like distant ghosts, her fingers still curled around the handle, as if to crush it further in her grip. She had come here after the call to Marcus went unanswered, his silence a confirmation of the text she'd pieced together. Late-night messages flickering in the dark, stolen hours in shadowed parks, heavy with the scent of wet leaves, the kind of secrets that festered until they poisoned everything with rot. "You think I wouldn't find out?" Evelyn's voice was a low rasp, laced with the exhaustion of too many guarded nights that weighed on her lids, heavy and unrelenting. Her gaze pinned Sophie, who fidgeted with a napkin, twisting it into damp shreds that tore softly, her anxious energy coiling like a spring about to snap in the confined space. Evelyn's drive to reclaim trust warred with the suspicion that had rooted deep, her fear of betrayal manifesting in this calculated ambush amid the clink of cups. She wouldn't be the fool again, not after the manipulations she'd employed to shield her own fragility, planting doubts like seeds, steering conversations away from her own cracks that ached. Sophie swallowed hard, her lips parting in a half-smile that didn't reach her eyes, shadowed with unease, passive-aggressive barbs already forming behind the plea for acceptance that trembled. "Evelyn, you're overreacting. It's not what you think." But her voice trembled, betraying the shadow she refused to see in herself, the subtle jabs, the withheld truths that kept people at arm's length, all in service of avoiding the abandonment that haunted her like a chill draft. She glanced toward the window, where the street outside blurred into gray anonymity under drizzling rain, her need for validation twisting into resentment that soured the air. Why did Evelyn always push like this, forcing her to defend what wasn't even real in the oppressive hum? The waitress hovered nearby, tray balanced precariously, but Evelyn ignored her, the oppressive weight of a revelation pressing down, like an unseen hand on her shoulders. Marcus's indifference, his closed-off armor hiding that simmering anger, like embers under ash, echoed in every evasive reply he'd given before, words lingering. Their shared history, nights of tentative openness shattered by his walls that loomed high, now fractured further by these clandestine meetings heavy with forbidden scents. Evelyn could picture him there, with Sophie, his drive to protect himself, leading him to these betrayals, fearing the hurt of true connection, yet inflicting it anyway in the dim corners. I saw the photos, Sophie, the timestamps, you and him, laughing in places we used to go. Evelyn's words hung, contemplative in their precision, each one a deliberate probe into the wound that throbbed. Dread seeped through her, not just for the act, but for how it mirrored her own shadows. The way she'd twist facts to avoid exposure, a habit like breathing. Sophie's face crumpled, a mix of defiance and desperation, her passive aggression surfacing in a sharp whisper that cut. If you trusted him, or me, you wouldn't be here, digging like this. Maybe you're the one pushing us away. The confession lingered unspoken between them, the emotional scar tissue tearing open wider in the bitter air. Evelyn felt the melancholy settle, a heavy fog in her chest that muffled the cafe's clamor to a dull roar fading. Trust, that fragile thing she'd chased through shadowed nights, slipped further, the pressure of their tangled fears building towards something irrevocable and cold. Sophie reached out, then withdrew, her hand hovering empty in the space between, the betrayal's sting mutual now, etching deeper lines of distrust into their fragile bonds like acid. Evelyn pushed back from the table, the chair scraping like a final verdict against the worn floor, leaving the spilled coffee to cool in accusation, its steam dissipating slowly. Hours blurred into a suffocating haze after the cafe's bitter spill, the stain on the tablecloth mirroring the rot festering in Evelyn's chest like an open sore. She wandered the rain-slicked streets, each step heavier with unspoken resentments that splashed underfoot, until the weight pulled her toward the shadowed house on Elmwood. There, in the dim flicker of a single lamp casting long, wavering shadows, the air grew thick with buried secrets, her pulse a slow drum of dread as old wounds threatened to tear open once more in the melancholic quiet. Nathan's fist slammed down on the scarred wooden table, splintering the edge of Sophie's saucer into jagged shards that skittered across the cafe floor like fleeing insects in the dim light. The crash cut through Evelyn's murmured apology, her hand withdrawing from the spilled coffee as if burned by its heat. But no one moved to clean it up amid the lingering steam. The bitter steam curled upward, unchecked and acrid, mingling with the sharp tang of Nathan's cologne, overpowering, like authority bottled and uncorked in the confined booth. Marcus sat rigid across from him, his fork paused midway to his untouched pastry, eyes fixed on the fracture in the porcelain, as if it mapped the fault lines in his own restraint, crumbling slowly. "You think that's accidental?" Nathan's voice sliced low, controlled yet edged, each word a deliberate incision into the tense air. He leaned forward, elbows planting into the damp tablecloth, ignoring the way the fabric stuck to his skin with cooling wetness. His gaze locked on Sophie, who shrank back in the booth, her fingers twisting the hem of her sweater, until threads unraveled like confessions she couldn't hold in the oppressive space. All these months, the late nights, the whispers. It's not coincidence. Tell him, Sophie. Tell Marcus what you've been hiding. Sophie's breath hitched, a ragged pull that echoed in the confined space of their corner booth, the vinyl seats creaking faintly. The cafe's hum, clinking cups, muffled laughter from distant tables, faded to a dull roar in her ears, drowned by the pulse hammering at her temples like a trapped bird. She glanced at Marcus, his face a mask of indifference, lips pressed thin, but she knew the flicker in his eyes, the shadow of anger he buried deep, the one that made his indifference feel like a locked door barring entry. Her drive clawed at her, to be seen, accepted, not cast aside like yesterday's regret in the dim glow. But the words lodged in her throat, passive-aggressive barbs she usually wielded, now crumbling into raw fear that chilled her. What if this shattered everything? What if he saw her unlovable core exposed? It's not what you think, she started, voice trembling like a leaf in wind. But Nathan's scoff interrupted, his hand gesturing sharply, demanding the truth he obsessed over in the heavy air. Control. That was his anchor, rigid and unyielding, born from the dread of looking weak, of betrayal's sting exposing his naivety like an open wound. He needed reasons, dissected and catalogued, or the isolation would swallow him whole in the shadows. Marcus finally spoke, his tone flat, almost bored, but laced with the undercurrent of fury he masked so well, simmering beneath. Just say it. Spare us the dance. He didn't look up, but his knuckles whitened around the fork, the metal biting into his palm with faint pressure. Protecting himself meant walls, high and indifferent. Opening up invited the hurt he feared most, a vulnerability that loomed. Yet here they were, in this dim-lit cage of velvet booths and flickering neon that buzzed faintly, the emotional weight pressing down like the low ceiling overhead, unyielding. Sophie swallowed, tears pricking hot at the corners of her eyes, stinging. I've been in love with you, Nathan, for years. Not just friends, not just whatever this is. The admission burst out, fracturing the air like glass, her passive-aggressive veil torn away to reveal the desperation beneath that clawed. She reached toward him, then pulled back, nails digging into her palms until they hurt. I couldn't say it before, not with Marcus here, not with everything so fragile. But it's eating me alive. From the inside. Nathan's face hardened, satisfaction warring with the rigid lines of his control slipping like sand. He wanted understanding, but this raw betrayal, stoked something darker, his obsession twisting into isolation's grip that tightened. Marcus's fork clattered to the plate, the sound a gunshot in the hush that rang. His indifference cracked, anger surging through like venom, hot and unchecked in his veins. He shoved back from the table, chair scraping harsh against tile, the booth feeling smaller, suffocating with the scent of spilled coffee. Years? While I sat here, blind, thinking we were... His voice broke, low growl rising to a snarl, dread coiling into rage at the scars of distrust carving deeper into his soul. Sophie flinched, her fear of abandonment blooming into terror that gripped her chest. But Nathan's eyes narrowed, already plotting the next move in this unraveling web of shadows. The spilled coffee cooled, staining the cloth a deeper crimson that spread slowly, as the weight of their confessions pressed heavier. The pressure building toward inevitable fracture in the contemplative dimness. The cafe's shattered silence echoed in Evelyn's retreating footsteps, the spilled coffee staining the floor like an accusation left to fester in the dim light. Hours dissolved into a heavy twilight, where betrayals from the day seeped into Claire's veins, thickening the air with unspoken dread that clung. Alone in the shadowed confines of her mind, hopelessness wrapped its fingers around her resolve, pulling her inexorably toward the door, and the final reckoning with Tom in the oppressive night. I can't keep pretending this isn't killing me. Evelyn's pulse throbs in her temples as she stares at the coffee stain spreading like ink across the tablecloth. Nathan's knuckles still white from the impact, veins standing stark. The shards of porcelain glint under the cafe's dim pendants, mocking her careful facade. The one she's polished for years to hide the raw edges of old wounds that ache. Sophie shifts in her seat, her nails digging into her palm. But Evelyn ignores the flicker of anxiety in her friend's eyes. No more games. Not now, in this suffocating space. Nathan, Evelyn says, her voice slicing through the stunned silence, low and edged with something feral that rises. She leans forward, the scent of bitter grounds and spilled milk clinging to her skin like accusation, heavy and cloying. You think slamming your fist fixes this? Pretending you're the victim when you've been lying to us both. His gaze snaps to hers, rigid lines etching deeper into his face under the flickering light. He straightens, that controlling mask slipping just a fraction, eyes narrowing, but she sees the flicker, the fear of exposure glinting. What the hell are you talking about? This isn't... It's everything. The words spill out reckless, unfiltered, her chest tightening as the guard she's worn like armor cracks under the strain. She accuses him outright, voice rising in the confined space, drawing a few sidelong glances from distant patrons who pretend not to listen amid the hum. The late nights you claim are work, the whispers with her. Don't deny it. You've betrayed us, Nathan. Me. All of it built on your need to pull the strings, and now? I'm done. I'm leaving. For good. Sophie's breath catches, a soft intake that hangs in the air like mist, her anxious fidgeting stilled for once in the tension. She wants to interject, to seek some validation in the chaos, but the passive-aggressive barbs she usually lobs stay trapped, her fear of abandonment rooting her silent and heavy. Nathan's hand twitches toward the table's edge, as if to reclaim control, but he doesn't touch it. Isolation creeps into his posture, shoulders squaring against the vulnerability she's forced into the open like light. You don't understand, he mutters, voice strained, probing for reasons even as his obsession coils tighter in the dim booth. It's not betrayal, it's protection. From weakness, from all this. Evelyn laughs, a hollow sound that echoes her dread, the manipulative urge to twist the knife, warring with the ache of true exposure that throbs. But the mask shatters further. Tears prick hot at her eyes, unbidden, as suspicion yields to the raw truth beneath in the melancholic air. Trust? Shattered again, just like the saucer underfoot. She pushes back her chair, the scrape loud against the tiled floor, legs unsteady beneath her in the haze. The cafe's oppressive hum, clinking cups, muffled voices, presses in, amplifying the hopelessness gnawing at her core like teeth. What's left when every relationship curdles into this void? Nathan reaches out, hesitant, his drive fracturing under the weight that presses. Evelyn, wait, we can... No. She stands, shadows of doubt lengthening across her face in the dim light. Sophie averts her eyes, the group's fragile bonds fraying, each confronting the denial that's bound them in silence. Evelyn walks toward the door. The bells jingle a final, contemplative toll that fades, leaving the stain to dry and the air thick with unspoken ruin. Hopelessness settles like dust, unyielding, as the masks lie in pieces on the floor, scattered and cold. Days blurred into a haze of fractured reflections, the cafe's shattered porcelain echoing in Evelyn's mind like a prelude to deeper cracks that resonated. She retreated into the dim confines of her apartment, the air thick with unspoken regrets that hung heavy, her pulse a dull thrum of impending dread in the quiet. Across the shadowed expanse of the city, Claire traced familiar paths homeward, her steps heavy with an unnameable fatigue, the weight of secrets pressing like an oppressive fog that muffled sounds. In that melancholic drift, the fragile veils of illusion thinned, drawing her inexorably toward the revelation that would drown her in quiet resignation, slow and inevitable. That's when Evelyn understood. Nathan hadn't slammed the cup in rage, but to drown out the secret he'd buried beneath years of calculated silences that lingered. The coffee's bitter steam curled upward, mingling with the faint metallic tang of spilled milk, as Marcus shifted in his seat across the scarred wooden table, his indifference cracking like the porcelain fragments at their feet, glinting faintly. She met Nathan's gaze, those rigid eyes that had always demanded her surrender, and saw the flicker, not control, but the hollow echo of his own unraveling in the dim light. "Nathan," she whispered, her voice a thread pulled taut in the hush. "You've been watching us. All this time. With him." Her finger jabbed toward Marcus, who froze, fork midway to his untouched pastry, the flaky crust crumbling under the pressure of her stare like fragile trust. The cafe's low hum, clinking saucers, muffled conversations, pressed in, a suffocating chorus amplifying the pulse in her ears that throbbed. Nathan's hand unclenched slowly, veins mapping the back like rivers dried to dust under strain. He leaned forward, the table's edge digging into his ribs, as if the pain could anchor him against the tide. Evelyn, it's not what you think. I needed to know. The betrayal, it started before you, before any of this. His words spilled out, deliberate yet fraying at the edges like worn cloth, revealing the obsession that had isolated him, turning allies into shadows that loomed. He glanced at Marcus, a silent plea laced with accusation that hung. He was supposed to help me understand why it always ends this way. In pieces. Marcus snorted, a sound devoid of humor, his closed-off posture slumping as anger seeped through the cracks like slow poison. He pushed his plate away, the scrape echoing like a confession in the quiet. Help? You dragged me into your web, Nathan, pretending it was about protection. His eyes, usually veiled in apathy, burned now, raw with the hurt he'd armored against for so long. The shadow of his rage surfaced unbidden in the way his fist curled against the tablecloth, staining it further with dark, irregular blooms of coffee. I stayed quiet to shield myself. But this? Watching you control her like some experiment? It ends now, before it consumes us all. Evelyn's chest tightened, the guarded walls she'd built, manipulation as her shield against another knife twist of trust, crumbling under the weight that pressed. She could taste the residue of her own deceptions, the subtle ways she twisted conversations to avoid this moment, this exposure that stung. The air in the cafe thickened with the scent of cooling espresso and regret, each breath a reminder of the facades they'd all worn. Nathan's iron grip masking isolation, Marcus's cool detachment hiding fury like embers, her suspicion a veil over the ache for something real in the gloom. She stood, chair legs groaning against the floorboards like weary protests, her hands pressing flat on the table to steady the tremor she refused to name in the hush. I thought, maybe this time, trust wasn't a lie. The words hung, vulnerable and stripped bare, her fear of betrayal laid bare in the quiver of her lip that trembled. Nathan reached out, but she recoiled, the motion instinctive, final as a door slamming. Marcus looked away, his indifference shattered, leaving only the quiet storm of his guarded heart exposed in the dim light. In that suspended beat, resignation settled over her like a shroud, heavy and inevitable, muffling the world. The masks had fractured, revealing not salvation, but the jagged truth, their hidden pains intertwined, pulling them deeper into the abyss of shadows. She turned toward the door, the bells chime a distant toll as the world outside blurred into irrelevance, cold and indifferent. 3 days blurred into a haze of fractured sleep and shadowed doubts, the spilled coffee stain a ghost on Evelyn's memory, as she became Claire in the quiet unraveling of her resolve that deepened. Unease coiled tighter in her chest, a leaden weight pressing against the walls of her empty apartment, where every creak echoed the betrayal's lingering echo like whispers. Driven by the dread of what lay fractured within, she gathered her coat and stepped into the rain-slicked evening, the support group's dim light beckoning like a fragile confessional in the mist. The faint scent of burnt coffee grounds jolted her. Nathan's grip on the mug, knuckles whitening before it shattered, his eyes pleading for the lie to hold one more day in the tension. Evelyn blinked hard, the memory dissolving into the dim hum of the community center basement, fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. 3 days had clawed by since that kitchen fracture, each hour a slow unraveling of the life she'd stitched together with careful denials that frayed. Now, she perched on a metal folding chair, its cold edge biting through her jeans like accusation, surrounded by a circle of strangers whose faces carried the same hollowed gaze in the stale air. The support group for betrayed spouses, words she typed into a search bar at 3 a.m., fingers hovering like accusations in the dark. No one spoke yet. The facilitator, a soft-voiced woman named Rita, passed around a chipped ceramic mug of weak tea, its steam carrying a herbal bitterness that clung to Evelyn's throat, sour and lingering. Marcus sat 2 seats away, his broad shoulders hunched forward, fingers interlaced so tightly the veins stood out like buried roots pulsing. He'd been at the meeting last week, she vaguely recalled from the online roster. But tonight, his eyes met hers briefly. Frustrated flickers, as if he willed the room to swallow his presence whole amid the shadows. Sophie, across the circle, fidgeted with a frayed bracelet, her nails bitten to ragged crescents, the kind of nervous tick that screamed unspoken barbs in the quiet. Rita cleared her throat, the sound slicing the quiet like a soft knife. Who wants to start? Remember, this is a safe space to peel back the layers. Slowly. Evelyn's pulse thudded, a conflicted hope warring in her chest like storm clouds. She wanted this, honesty, raw and unarmored. But the shadow of her old manipulations whispered to bolt, to twist the narrative before it could wound her again in the dimness. Betrayal's echo lingered. Nathan's secret, not rage, but a deliberate hush over infidelity's rot that festered. She raised a hand, voice emerging thinner than intended, fragile. My husband, he didn't yell. He just broke things to cover it up. 3 days ago, I saw through it all, the lies. The group leaned in, a collective inhale that pressed against her skin like damp wool, heavy and close. Marcus shifted, his indifference fracturing. He rubbed his temple, then spoke, words gravelly and edged with something fiercer than apathy that rumbled. Mine was the opposite, silent fury, bottled until it poisoned everything. I pretended it didn't touch me, but... He trailed off, jaw not tightening but softening. Vulnerability cracking through like light under a door in the gloom. His fear hung there, opening this wound, only to bleed alone in the circle. Yet he pushed, drive flickering. Connect, confront the anger he'd masked for years amid the hum. Sophie snorted softly, passive-aggressive veil slipping as her eyes welled with unshed tears. Pretend? That's all we do. My partner's lies made me feel invisible, like I wasn't worth the truth. I snap at nothing, push people away, but God, I just want to be seen. Insecurity laced her confession, a challenge to her own abandonment dread, her unacknowledged barbs turning inward now, raw and trembling in the stale air. Evelyn nodded, the motion pulling at her resolve like threads. Their stories wove into hers, infidelities unearthed like buried bones from damp earth, the emotional chasm yawning wider with each shared fracture that echoed. The basement walls seemed to close in, fluorescent buzz droning like distant accusations, the tea's aftertaste souring on her tongue like regret. Unease coiled in her gut, not just from the revelations, but the mirror they held. Her own facade splintering, vulnerability exposed in this circle of fractured souls under the harsh light. What if honesty invited more betrayal? Marcus's gaze met hers again, hopeful yet guarded. Sophie's hand twitched toward connection, then retreated into shadow. The session dragged on, contemplative pauses stretching into oppressive silences, dread threading through every admission like invisible wire, taut and unyielding. The memory's shards lingered in the basement's stale air, sharpening Claire's suspicion into a blade she couldn't sheathe, glinting coldly. Weeks dissolved in contemplative silence, each session a heavier veil of melancholy draping the circle's shared despair that deepened. Oppressive dread thickened the shadows, her mind adrift in rich currents of unspoken betrayal, until one raw evening stirred the undercurrent toward something darker, insidious. The faint tang of spilled coffee lingered on Nathan's sleeve, sharp against the musty undercurrent of the basement air that clung. He stared at the fragments scattered across the linoleum, each jagged edge catching the fluorescent flicker overhead, like accusations. The group circle felt tighter now, chairs scraping as bodies leaned in, the weight of unspoken fractures pressing down relentlessly. Marcus sat across from him, arms crossed like a barrier against the chill, his breath coming in measured huffs that betrayed the storm brewing beneath his indifference in the dim glow. Sophie, wedged between them, twisted a frayed tissue in her lap, her nails digging crescents into her palm. Small wounds she could control, unlike the larger ones carving through her chest with dull pain. I can't keep pretending, Nathan said finally, his voice cracking like the mug had. low and ragged in the hush. He met Marcus's gaze, then Sophie's, the plea in his eyes from moments ago hardening into resolve that flickered. The lies, they started small, a forgotten promise here, a hidden resentment there. But it was me, all along. I manipulated the trust because I couldn't stand not being the one in charge. Sophie, you deserved better than my shadows pulling the strings. In the dark. Sophie's fingers stilled, the tissue crumpling into a damp ball that felt heavy. She lifted her chin, eyes narrowing, not with tears this time, but a glint of something fiercer, her insecurity coiling into assertion like a spring. Better? You think confessing now makes it vanish? I saw how you isolated us, Nathan. Played us like pawns to keep your grip. Marcus and I, we were just collateral in your need to never feel small. Her words hung, laced with the passive bite she wielded like a shield, unacknowledged even as it sliced the air thickly. She turned to Marcus, her voice softening but edged sharply. And you, Marcus, your silence let it fester. All that anger you bury, it's not indifference, it's fear. Of us seeing you break. Truly. Marcus's jaw didn't clench. Instead, he uncrossed his arms, leaning forward as if the motion cost him every ounce of will. Frustration etched lines around his mouth, but he pushed through, voice gravelly and low. Yeah, I'm angry. Furious at the betrayal, at how it twisted everything we had. But hiding it? That's done. I want to connect, damn it, even if it guts me. His eyes flicked to Nathan, then Sophie, vulnerability cracking his mask like thin ice. What do we do with this truth? Pretend it's not poison? Seeping in? The basement hummed on, the fluorescent buzz a relentless underscore to their unraveling, droning softly. Sophie exhaled, a slow release that carried the weight of her fears, of abandonment, of being the unlovable one left behind in the shadows. Yet here she was, challenging it, her shadow self emerging in the way her gaze sharpened on Nathan like a blade. Truth like this, it doesn't just expose, it arms you. She paused, her words deliberate, planting themselves like thorns in the quiet. I've thought about it, you know. Revenge. Not the screaming kind, but quiet. Taking back what you stole, our power, our choices. Imagine it. Turning the tables so slowly they don't see it coming. Wouldn't that feel like justice, in the end? Nathan shifted, the porcelain crunch echoing again under his heel, sharp and brittle. His doubt swelling into something raw that gripped. Control slipped from his grasp, vulnerability forcing its way out. But her hint twisted it into unease that coiled. Was this openness, or a trap woven in shadows? Marcus's eyes darted between them, suspicion blooming in his chest, like ink and water. Dread that the confessions were just the prelude to deeper fractures lurking. Sophie's suggestion lingered, a dark seed taking root, its tendrils wrapping around the fragile threads of trust they'd begun to mend in the dim light. The circle held, oppressive in its intimacy, each breath a contemplation of what might shatter next, inevitable and cold. Hours after the circle fractured into uneasy dispersal, Claire slipped into the night's oppressive hush, the basement's musty weight settling deeper into her bones like lead. Anger simmered beneath her skin, unyielding as the spilled coffee's bitter stain, twisting toward a desperate hunger for closure that burned. Fear coiled in her chest, a melancholic dread of shattered lives exposed, yet she couldn't turn away from the pull. Alone in her dim-lit room, shadows lengthening like unspoken accusations across the walls, her mind began to map the encounter, each contemplated step heavy with foreboding that pressed. The echo of apologies that never came. Sophie's gaze fixed on the linoleum shards, where coffee's dark stain bloomed like a bruise, refusing to fade under the light. The basement's fluorescent hum droned on, indifferent, while the circle of chairs creaked under shifting weights that echoed softly. Nathan sat across from her, his sleeves rolled unevenly, the spill's bitterness still clinging to the fabric like regret. Evelyn, beside him, traced invisible patterns on her knee, her breath shallow, measured, too controlled for the unraveling at hand in the stale air. No one moved to sweep the mess. The air tasted of damp concrete and regret, thick enough to coat the tongue with its weight. Sophie's pulse thudded in her ears, a dull rhythm against the silence that stretched, pulling at the edges of their fragile truce like fraying threads. She had come here chasing validation, a chance to voice the hollow ache inside her. But now, words clawed up her throat, unbidden, fueled by the fury she'd buried under layers of quiet endurance that cracked. "Nathan," she said, her voice slicing the quiet like a blade through silk, steady but edged. It emerged steady, but her fingers curled into her palms, nails biting skin she couldn't feel amid the tension. "Tell me again how it was just late nights at the office, how Evelyn was only a colleague lending an ear." Nathan's eyes lifted, meeting hers for the first time since the mug shattered, doubt flickering there like a dying flame. Control had always been his armor, but now it slipped, leaving him exposed, doubts flooding in like cold water that chilled. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, the chair groaning in protest under him. "Sophie, this isn't the place. We're all raw here. What good does dredging it do now?" Evelyn's hand twitched toward him, then withdrew, as if the motion burned with invisible fire. Her face, usually a mask of poised hope, fractured, eyes darting between them, lips parting on a breath that carried the scent of her faint lavender lotion, now soured by tension in the air. She wanted honesty, craved it like air in the stuffy room, but the shadow of her old manipulations whispered retreat, safety and deflection that tempted. Sophie's laugh escaped, brittle and low, devoid of mirth that echoed hollowly. "Dredging? You mean exposing what you've both hidden while I pretended it was fine. The texts I found, Nathan? The ones you deleted but not fast enough. Her voice on your phone at midnight, laughing like she belonged there." She turned to Evelyn, the words a lash that cut. "And you, playing the confidant, all while slipping into his bed. Motives laid bare now, aren't they? Not friendship, not support, just the thrill of taking what was mine." The confession hung, unraveling the air between them like mist. Nathan's shoulders sagged, vulnerability seeping through his guarded stance, fear of appearing weak coiling tight in his chest like wire. He opened his mouth, closed it, the drive to release control battling the isolation he'd built brick by brick in silence. "It started as escape," he murmured finally, voice rough as gravel scraping. "The pressure. You pulling away, Sophie, even when I tried." Evelyn listened, but it twisted. "I know that now. Too late." Evelyn's eyes welled, not with tears, but with the dread of mirrors held too close, reflecting harshly. "I didn't plan to hurt you," she whispered, her tone laced with conflict, a hopeful thread fraying in the dimness. "But I saw him slipping and I reached, to feel needed, to avoid being alone in my own mess." Her fear of betrayal mirrored back at her, sharp and unrelenting. Had she orchestrated this wound herself in the shadows? Sophie's chest tightened, the room pressing in, walls seeming to lean closer with each breath that labored. She envisioned it then, unbidden, cornering them both outside, under the streetlight's cold glare, voices rising until neighbors stirred, the affair stripped public and raw like flesh. Anger surged, a dark current demanding closure, consequences be damned in the night. But beneath it, fear bloomed, cold, insidious. What if exposure left her more alone, unlovable in the wreckage that loomed? Her passive barbs, once subtle, now echoed in her mind, shadows she couldn't outrun in the hush. Nathan reached across the circle, hand hovering, then falling limp. "We confront this," he said, softer, the words a plea that trembled. "No more hiding. Please." But the basement swallowed the offer, leaving only the dread's quiet pulse, truths exposed like veins laid open, bleeding slow into the oppressive air. That same evening, as the therapy group's shadows lingered like unspoken regrets in the dimness, the weight of fractured bonds pressed heavier elsewhere across the city. Across the dim-lit sprawl of the city, resentment coiled in the air, thick and unyielding, mirroring the bruise of spilled secrets that throbbed. Tom, adrift in the oppressive hush of his apartment, felt the chasm widen, his thoughts turning inescapably to Claire, her silence a festering wound that demanded reaching, even as dread whispered of rebuff in the shadows. Outside, the muffled roar of a delivery truck grinding past the alley grate, vibrating faintly. Inside, Evelyn's breath, shallow and edged, slicing through the basement's stale hush like a whisper. She shifted in her chair, the metal frame groaning like a confession withheld too long under strain. Across the circle, Nathan's eyes flicked toward her, his fingers splayed on his knees. Not clenched, not anymore, but open in that tentative way that made her stomach twist with unease. The coffee stain on the floor had dried to a brittle crust, flaking under Marcus's scuffed boot as he leaned forward, elbows on thighs, his gaze locking onto hers, with a rawness that bordered on desperation in the fluorescent glow. "Marcus," Evelyn said, her voice a low wire, taut and unyielding in the quiet. The word hung, pulling the room's oxygen thin like a vacuum. She could taste the phantom bitterness of the spilled brew on her tongue. Or maybe it was just the resentment coiling in her chest, hot and familiar as old scars. He didn't flinch. "Ev, I need to say this, before it festers more." His words tumbled out, gravelly, laced with the frustration he'd been nursing like a secret bruise that ached. Around them, the fluorescent tubes buzzed their relentless hymn, casting elongated shadows that clawed at the concrete walls with fingers. Nathan watched, silent, his own doubts mirroring in the way his shoulders eased, just a fraction. Vulnerability creeping in, unbidden, as if the air itself demanded it in the heaviness. Evelyn's lips parted, but no softness came. Instead, a wall slammed up, her shadow self whispering manipulations to shield the raw hope flickering beneath like a candle. "Say it then," she challenged, eyes narrowing sharply. "But don't think words mend what's shattered. You reached for me before, promised bridges, and look where that left us. Broken." Marcus's face hardened, his deep-seated anger peeking through the mask of indifference. But he pressed on, drive pulling him toward connection, despite the fear gnawing at his edges like teeth. "I was wrong. Hiding behind that indifference, letting the rage call the shots, betrayed you by not fighting for us, by letting Rachel's lies twist everything." The name dropped like a stone into still water. Rachel, the ghost who'd unraveled them all with her whispered deceptions. Motives now laid bare in fragments from prior sessions that lingered. He extended a hand, not touching, but close enough to feel the warmth hovering. "I'm trying here, to confront it, to connect, if you'll let me." Nathan cleared his throat, the sound small against the oppressive weight that smothered. His obsession with control warred visibly, jaw not tight but held, as if releasing it might expose the naivety he dreaded like weakness. "It's not just words, Marcus," he interjected, voice steadying into openness that cracked. "We all carry this. Evelyn, I controlled too much, isolated us to avoid the weakness. But seeing this, your reach, it's forcing me to face it. All of it." Evelyn recoiled from Marcus's hand, the gesture cold as the linoleum shards crunching underfoot. Brittle. Resentment bloomed, sharp and unrelenting, tinting her hope with dread that chilled. "No," she said flatly, the rebuff a blade slicing. "You sense the distance now, after all the tension you've fed? I won't mend it. Not when betrayal's truth stares back. Your anger masking the hurt you won't own. My manipulations dodging the pain." She stood, chair scraping harsh against the floor, her conflicted heart pounding in rhythm with the truck's fading growl outside that rumbled. "I'm done reaching back. Rachel's the one I'll confront, not this half-shadow of us." Marcus slumped, frustration etching deeper lines around his eyes. Yet a spark of engagement lingered. He'd begun, even if rebuffed in the quiet. Nathan rose halfway, doubt swirling but vulnerability anchoring him. the circle fracturing under the weight of unveiled motives that pressed. The fluorescent hum swelled, indifferent to the truth splintering the air, leaving only the echo of what might have been, faint and lost. Hours bled into dusk, Evelyn's shallow breaths echoing into a heavier silence, the basement's chill seeping into her bones, like unspoken regrets that numbed. That night, miles away, Claire's footsteps faltered on the rain-slicked pavement, grief coiling in her chest, like damp fog that soaked through. The weight of her plan pressed down, oppressive and unyielding,